It's Thursday, it's 12:15 and we're live in Westminster. Joining me today, the Conservative MP Laura Farris, the leader of the Scottish Liberal Democrats, Willie Rennie, the environmentalist and author George Monbiot, and the Telegraph's deputy political editor Lucy Fisher. Today, Boris Johnson's colleagues defend his text messages.
What the Prime Minister did was to ensure that things happened. Now, this is the dither and delay of the socialists. They don't want to do things. They want to put the process ahead of succeeding.
I left the room and I was sacked by text, pretty poor.
Why was the Veterans Minister relieved of his duties yesterday?
Every single woman I know will have a story to tell about how they were harassed or assaulted, in fact, on the streets of this country.
Labour MP Jess Phillips tells us why a national stalkers register would help protect women. And
This bank is causing mass extinction! Mass extinction!
are companies doing enough to adapt to a net zero world? Let's start with the story in the headlines there about Boris Johnson and text messages. Let's show you the headline in the Guardian newspaper. Boris Johnson is constantly lobbied by text, sources admit. It's also reported today, off the back of those text messages between the industrialist Sir James Dyson and the Prime Minister over ventilators at the beginning of the pandemic, that not only is he constantly lobbied, but that Simon Case, the head of the Civil Service, says he should change his number. Now, it's also reported that Boris Johnson has said no, rejected the suggestion, as he's had the same number for 10 years. I should add, number 10 doesn't recognise the story. But my question to start the programme to all of you, Laura, should he change his mobile number?
I've got to say, Jo, I don't have a strong view on that either way.
And do you have his number?
I'm in one WhatsApp group that the Prime Minister's in, but I've never messaged him myself.
Is it a bit strange, then, that perhaps a Tory MP like you doesn't have his number, but so many other people do seem to?
Well, I think I do kind of agree with points that have been made by others that a public figure should to some extent be accessible, and I think it's up to him really who his number goes to. I don't think the fact that James Dyson was able to text him in an emergency situation a year ago, is something that's out of the ordinary. I just don't think it's for me to comment on whether he should change his number or not.
And what about you, Willie? Everyone's distracted by their phone these days, and everyone communicates by text. Why shouldn't Boris Johnson have his own private mobile and use it as he sees fit?
Well, we know that he kind of plays fast and loose with the rules quite a lot. So it's what he does with these messages that's probably more important as to whether he is accessible. And therefore, I think the advice from the civil service was probably wise. It'd be good to actually formally regulate the communications with all these industrialists and business people to make sure he's sticking by the rules rather than the usual Boris Johnson style of government. Right, but do you think he should change the mobile number, as it seems suggested by the head of the Civil Service, or not? It sounds like the Civil Service would like to take his phone away from him. But yeah, no, he should change his number. All right. George, you'd like the Prime Minister's mobile number, wouldn't you? Unless you've already got it to lobby him over green issues. Tony Blair, former Labour Prime Minister, said he didn't have a mobile phone, but that was a different era. What would you suggest as an alternative?
Well, look, public business should not be conducted in private channels, and Boris Johnson's phone should be preserved for his family, his friends and his mistresses. It should not be used for public business. On that, Lucy, is there a sense that the existing lobbying rules don't quite capture the modern methods of communication? They're not really sort of nimble enough for 2021?
Well, I think that's right, particularly in light of the revelation in the Times today that the Prime Minister uses Signal, an app popular across Westminster that auto-deletes messages after a time. I think there are growing concerns, particularly among the opposition, about the storage of these messages, whether they can be scrutinised later along the line if issues like the Greensill row erupt. So I think you're right that it's the case that some of the technology has progressed beyond the rules and needs to be relooked at.
Right. Well, Boris Johnson isn't the only one being texted. We are hearing today from the Public Accounts Committee, Sir Tom Scholar, the most senior official at the Treasury, is in front of MPs. And he said to them that he's received texts and phone calls on his personal mobile from former Prime Minister David Cameron, who was lobbying on behalf of the now failed finance company Greensill. And the Permanent Secretary told the Public Accounts Committee that Mr Cameron had spoken to him on the phone. There is also this headline in the Metro newspaper. The headline says they're taking the PPE. And this is talking about the way PPE contracts were awarded. Again, most of those at the beginning of the pandemic last year, and to whom? Allegations of cronyism. Laura, when you add all this up, there is mounting evidence, isn't there, about the way in which this government does business?
Well, can I just separate out a few of the points you were just making, Jo? I don't think it's any secret that this time last year, probably about 13, 14 months ago, the response was an exceptional one. I mean, and one of the things you saw, for example, in the Dyson case is somebody who typically manufactures something else offering to manufacture ventilators. You saw beverage companies manufacturing hand sanitizer. Even clothing companies like Burberry were making hospital gowns. So there was a moment when there was a desperate grab for equipment and PPE. And actually, in some ways, I think it's to the credit of the Prime Minister that he was taking direct control of some of that when people were absolutely desperate for it on the front line. Now, the second part of your question is, well, perhaps stepping back from the emergency response, is it right that you have the spectacle of ex-prime ministers texting people and appearing to be able to get very close to, the levers of power? And I think that is a fair concern to raise, actually. And I'm glad that this inquiry has been initiated, because I think it's legitimate to raise that. I think it's also fair to say, though, because the exchanges with the former Prime Minister and Rishi were disclosed, that he didn't get the result he was looking for. I mean, the sort of the mechanisms did operate correctly. I know that more will come through the inquiry, but a lot has been made of just the fact that Rishi responded to him. And I struggle to see that was an unreasonable thing to do, actually, in the circumstances. Yeah.
All right. Well, George, as we mentioned earlier on, lobbying is what happens on a day-to-day basis. People want access to government, and it's proven, having this inquiry and many others, that there is transparency in the system. And you would want to be free to lobby green causes, for example.
Yeah, lobbying is part of politics. It's got to be part of politics, but it must be transparent, accountable and conducted through public channels.
Well, that's why they've got these inquiries looking into it, isn't it, George?
Well,
it is transparent.
Exactly, but, we're seeing a consistent pattern ever since this government took office of insiders using inside tracks, VIP channels to get contracts to supply PPE, blatant profiteering in the middle of a national emergency, people who were completely unqualified to provide that PPE and other equipment, and in many cases totally failed to do so, but whose common characteristics seem to be that they had friends in government. And we see this with Greensill, we see this now with Boris Johnson using his private phone to basically give favours, to say, oh, yeah, we can do that deal for you. Now, they know what to call this in other countries. Right. They don't call it lobbying. They don't call it cronyism. They call it corruption.
All right, Laura?
But if I could just come back on the example that George just gave of James Dyson. If the Prime Minister had said to James Dyson, OK, actually, don't worry about making the ventilators, keep your staff in Singapore, I'm not sure we can do anything for them. And if the NHS had been short of ventilators at a time when ICU wards were filling up and people were dying in their multiple hundreds day by day, and the Prime Minister was seen to have put a stop in that because of a tight fiscal rule that he wasn't prepared to release, I think he would have been subject to a torrent of criticism from the public for not acting swiftly enough. So
I'm sorry,
I think
but that's a ridiculous argument.
Why?
I think it is.
The reason it's a ridiculous argument is that during national emergencies, you have to make the best possible decisions, and that must be done publicly and accountably with experts involved, rather than text messages between the Prime Minister, who frankly knows nothing about ventilators, and why should he, and someone, a mate of his, who's offering to supply them. Now, very kindly offering to supply them. It turned out they weren't the right ventilators, they weren't used anyway. And this is a very good example of why these things should be done accountably, upfront, publicly, through the normal channels rather than through the back door.
Laura?
I just would say it was through this kind of emergency response that we got enough ventilators into the UK over a period of about 6 weeks. And at no point, although this has never really been reported, at no point did the NHS ever have a shortage of ventilators in the event, because we ramped up supply so quickly. And even when we got to the second wave, when it was really, really critical, particularly, for example, in London, there has never been in any hospital a situation where they didn't have a ventilator to put a patient on. And
we also saw during this emergency the kind of profiteering for which people were imprisoned during the Second World War.
All right. Willie, you wanted to come in. I could see you raise your hand.
George is onto something there. I mean, if the fact that we have to have a personal relationship with the Prime Minister, not what you're capable of doing, but who you know rather than what you know, then the system has failed. It should never take the Prime Minister to sort out a tax situation. That should come through the proper systems of government. So it's the casual, freelancing, free-riding, close relationship that's gone wrong.
And Willie, are you saying that Liberal Democrats who've left politics have never engaged in any lobbying of the kind that you are describing? I mean, Nick Clegg is in the private sector, Danny Alexander, your current leader, Ed Davey, worked for a lobbying firm when he lost his seat in 2015. So you can't be too holier than thou about it.
But there's a way about doing these things, isn't there? I mean, I don't know what the relationship is with the current government, but what I can tell you is I'm in favour of having proper, regulated, transparent and open systems. And that applies to whoever, whether it's former members of my party or not. I want to make sure we have a transparent system. So there's minuted meetings so we can publish those, because I think that's the way to make sure we've got confidence in government. So it's not just the cronies, it's not just the cosy relationship, it's making sure we can get value for money and speed rather than relying on these casual, cosy relationships.
And before I go to you, I mean, just briefly, do you think Nick Clegg and Danny Alexander have the mobile phone numbers of senior politicians now? I'm sure they do.
I don't know. To be honest, I've not spoken to them about it. But I just tell you what I want to do.
Lucy, Keir Starmer yesterday, the Labour leader in the Commons yesterday at Prime Minister's Questions, called it sleaze. Does the public agree? Is it cutting through?
Well, I think that's a really good question. And in one sense, I think with the James Dyson text message example, a lot of people will think, well, it was the early phases of the pandemic. It was a very scary, unknown situation. There was this urgent call out. The government had sort of set the challenge for private sector manufacturing businesses to switch production to ventilators. James Dyson was among a number of companies that answered that call. And in fact, he had submitted the correspondence through the correct channels to the Treasury and had messaged the Prime Minister trying to expedite that or get it looked at. I think many people will think the specifics of this example possibly warranted, him sort of cutting across officials to contact the Prime Minister directly, given the circumstances. But I do think we're going to hear a lot more about the wider issue of what Meg Hillier, the chairman of the Public Accounts Committee, has called WhatsApp government, and the ability of people to message the Prime Minister or a variety of other ministers across the heads of officials, and whether that is being registered and scrutinised in the correct way.
Right, well, let's hear what Justin Welby, the Archbishop of Canterbury, his thoughts on this whole idea of lobbying and making representations to government.
Politicians are human beings. If we want perfect politicians, there won't be anyone sitting in the House of Commons. We'll never have another Prime Minister. We can't have a royal family. There's nobody who can rule if we insist that they're faultless and flawless. And when we do that, which we do too often, we lead to hypocrisy and all kinds of things.
George, I mean, that was from Political Thinking, I should say, the BBC's podcast. George, your response on the sort of character side, if you like, that Justin Welby was talking about there when it comes to politicians.
Well, of course, we can't find perfect people to represent us because no such people exist. But at the same time, we should have the systems in place to ensure that people just can't go freelance on this stuff and give favours to mates through backdoor channels. It's a question of the systems. The systems must be in place, the accountability, the transparency. And what we're repeatedly seeing is that they're either not in place or they're not enforced.
All right. Just to give you some polling, recent polling from Ipsos Mori, that's in March this year, shows that 10% of people in the UK are worried about corruption compared to 27% in the US. Admittedly, that's from March. Now, we're going to move on. Let me just show you this headline in the Huff Post. Johnny Mercer brands Westminster a cesspit full of liars. Sacked Tory Veterans Minister says Boris Johnson's government is the most distrustful, awful environment I have ever worked in. He said he was going to resign, but in fact was sacked, interestingly, by text. That does seem to be the theme of this programme and politics just at the moment. But that description of working in the most distrustful, awful environment I've ever worked in, that's quite a claim, Laura, isn't it?
Well, I think Johnny made clear when he was interviewed last night that he was expressing frustration about the Overseas Operations Bill and the issue of veterans in Northern Ireland. And I take my hat off actually to Johnny for the work that he's done with veterans and for opening the office for Veterans Affairs. But I would just point out that Ben Wallace, the Secretary of State, also served in Northern Ireland. Johnny's replacement, Leo, is a veteran who fought in Afghanistan and Iraq. And one of the things that we've seen in the last few months with things like the Overseas Operations Bill, that there were some incredibly difficult human rights issues to work through, because the effect of the bill is to impose effectively a limitation period on certain certain crimes being, big charges being brought against British service personnel. That included issues like torture.
Yes.
And those were incredibly complex things. So I understand that Johnny feels frustrated and so on, but I just want to make the point that this is nuanced, complex stuff that engages, and I think to the extent that he was critical of the government, I think it was a reflection of what he felt about certain pieces of legislation rather than a general statement. And I think that was consistent with his interviews that I saw last night.
Well, we are going to talk about the substance. I just wanted to get your comment, which you have sort of partially given, about his description of government. He may have been frustrated, but that is a damning claim to say it is the most distrustful, awful environment. And what do you say about the atmosphere that he was obviously operating in?
Well, I mean, I'm not in government, I'm just a backbencher, but I didn't, Johnny was certainly giving the impression of being, was actually thriving in his role and being very proud of the work that he was doing for veterans. So I don't know what happened. And actually, I think that the progress, both of the Overseas Operations Bill and in relation to Northern Ireland, which is out of scope because, of course, the conflict wasn't overseas.
Right.
And is also historic, whereas the Overseas Operations Bill is forward-looking and will apply to future conflicts rather than looking back at the Troubles. I don't see... I genuinely don't actually understand why Johnny's resigned, if I'm completely honest, because my impression was that it was going well.
All right, well, let's hear from Johnny Mercer himself. You're quite right. He says claims the government is failing to uphold a manifesto commitment to veterans of the Northern Ireland conflict, as you say, separate from the Overseas Operations Bill. This is what he told Newsnight last night.
The reality is I disagree with the concept of people who are in their 70s and 80s being tried again for things that took place a long time ago.
The Northern Ireland conflict saw a lot of suffering, including the families of people killed by the army. Is it not right that there be a due process in this?
Absolutely. And I absolutely, where there is evidence of criminal wrongdoing, there is absolutely no hiding place in the military.
Johnny Mercer there last night. George, is it right that veterans of the Northern Ireland conflict face these repeated investigations?
Well, of course, crimes or alleged crimes should be investigated. Absolutely. And why should any particular category of people have a particular leniency shown to them by the justice system which isn't shown to other people? And I think that British soldiers have a particular duty to uphold high standards and to uphold the law during operations, and indeed not during operations as well. And it seems crazy to me that we should say there's one law for ordinary citizens and a different, more lenient law for soldiers.
Right, well, Lucy, is that what is being said?
In a word, no. And in fact, I think it is the perceived unfairness in the treatment of soldiers, veterans, for whom there are extensive records that can be repeatedly subjected to investigation, that is asymmetric to the sort of records that don't exist, frankly, of the IRA and other linked terror groups, where there aren't the evidential basis to really investigate. And that's one sort of disparity that has led to the argument here. I think it is a very difficult situation. We actually haven't seen the proposals that the government has brought forward. They have said that they are committed to announcing something in the Queen's speech, so we do need to see the details. But I'm absolutely confident from all I've been hearing from government sources that whatever is brought forward, if they do get agreement, it will have the level of buy-in from all parties. It certainly won't be just some sort of amnesty for British soldiers. That, of course, wouldn't be acceptable to victims groups. And indeed, this isn't just a question that affects the UK. The Republic of Ireland also has a lot of opinions on this, and I think there would have to be a parallel process in Ireland. So it's clear to me why it's taken a long time, but talks are continuing behind the scenes. And I think perhaps that wasn't quite reflected in what Johnny Mercer has said in the past 24 to 48 hours. But clearly he is very impassioned about the subject and has been very upset that progress hasn't been made at a faster pace.
Willie?
Yeah, I mean, I'm confused slightly about what Johnny Mercer and the reasons for it. But I think one thing is clear, that both Laura and Lucy are right, that this is a very sensitive situation. And I think probably the Prime Minister now regrets making such a bold commitment previously about immunity from prosecution and with some degree. I mean, it probably mirrors what's happened with his bold commitment in terms of putting a border down the Irish Sea. I just think this part of the country, the politics, the world, the society is very sensitive, and it leads to, you need more nuance and you need more sensitivity rather than the kind of the bold assertions that are made in public platforms. So I think, I'm confused as to what Johnny Mercer's doing. It would be useful if you could explain a little bit more of the detail, but we need to make sure we get to a case where we're able to bring everybody together in the whole of Ireland as well as the United Kingdom to make sure, that people feel comfortable with this process, that people who have broken the law in the past are able to be prosecuted, whilst we're able to move on and get reconciliation in Northern Ireland moving on from the Troubles. It's very sensitive and it requires an awful lot more nuance than as perhaps has been delivered in the past.
All right, we're going to leave that discussion there and move on to talk about the Domestic Abuse Bill. I'm just going to show viewers this headline in The Times: Lords back database for serial stalkers. This headline and story follows on from last night when peers defeated the government in a final effort to force through proposals to add serial stalkers to a national register of violent and sex offenders. We can talk to the Shadow Minister on domestic violence and safeguarding, Jess Phillips, Labour MP. Just explain to us exactly what this amendment is, Jess.
Well, what this amendment seeks to do is to ensure that current existing, what we call MAPA, which is multi-agency public protection, basically, that is a way that we monitor the most serious and violent criminals, whether that's sex offenders, as you've said, or terrorists, for example, are monitored through this system where they have proper offender managers looking at their case in a multi-agency setting so that they can follow and essentially prevent future crimes by these people. Now, what we're seeking in this amendment is to include in that serial stalkers and those who have committed the most dangerous domestic abuse offences, because currently, while the government argument, and no doubt that is what they're going to say, is, oh, it already could include them, but it never, ever does. In my experience on the front line for many, many years, I can't remember a single case where there was went on to be a murder or a very serious domestic abuse incident where the person who perpetrated it had been part of one of these MAPAs, as we call them.
All right.
So it to get that to happen.
Laura, why is the government opposed?
So I think it is important to just make clear what the contours of the disagreement are. It is just said absolutely correctly. There are already 3 categories that exist under MAPA: for sexual offenders, for serious violence offenders, and for dangerous offenders, all of which people who have a previous history of domestic abuse would fall into typically 1 or 3. Now, the difference that the government has is not disagreeing that these people should be recorded under MAPA. They should be. But the government says that where the problem has arisen, it's not because they're not recorded, it's because the agencies are not adequately sharing information between them, which has allowed people to slip through the gaps. And they've sort of pointed to examples where there have been gaps in information. So what the government seeks to do is strengthen the existing system rather than add a new category 4 onto the existing MAPA categories. But I just want to be clear, it's quite a narrow area of disagreement, and I'm very respectful to what Jess says on this because she's got such a body of experience on it. It's really about whether we add a new category or we improve what's there. That's the basis of the disagreement.
Jess, you were shaking your head.
Look, the reality is, and Laura can't say this because, I understand she's in a difficult position, and in reality, her and I are almost always on the same page on these things, is that the reality is that the reason that the people we're talking about, it's not a small number of people. It's thousands of people, thousands of very, very violent offenders. And the reason that they're not put on there is it's a postcode lottery. Some DCIs in police forces will put them on there. But the reality is because there aren't the resources to properly monitor. And the government need to admit that it's nothing to do with information sharing. It's absolutely nothing to do with that. It's because there are too many of them, and they've decided it's just too big a job. And they're expecting women in our country to be unsafe on the streets and to bear the burden of this. That is the reality. A little bit more communication between agencies is the same thing that gets said periodically every couple of years when there's a death or a child death. It's just not good enough. We need a separate category so that they have to go on there.
Laura, it's about resources?
Well, I listened to what Baroness Williams said in the Lords last night, because like Jess, I was following it very closely. And she said, we would have no objection to amending the existing statutory framework if we thought it would make a difference to the outcomes of victims, but we're not persuaded that it does. And she gave the example of the cases that had been used by the Lords in front of her, where the people basically it was information sharing that had led to the kind of the failures of outcome. Now, look, I feel like as we're having this debate, this is still a conversation that's continuing, and I'm sort of, the domestic abuse bill is too important to both to MPs, to me and MPs on my side, and to Jess and many on hers. And I think, this is just not something where I'm going to get into kind of boiling conflict about, because as I say, both sides are really committed to trying to find a way through this. It's almost the last piece of the jigsaw, really, in what is a transformational piece of legislation that I hope is going to be on the statute books within a week or so.
Jess, just before I get you to respond, Laura, are you minded to support this amendment? You say that it's an ongoing conversation. Are you inching towards it?
No, I have been persuaded by the government, but I don't listen to Jess in a sense of like an adversarial spirit, because I do know that she brings an unparalleled sort of amount of experience to this issue.
OK, I mean, Jess, in terms of the response, it is much broader, isn't it, the bill, as Laura is saying? Yeah. There's lots of very important stuff in there. Absolutely. Is it right to focus in the way that she says it's quite a narrow focus on this one particular issue? And do you not also feel that it's covered enough by existing legislation? I know you say it isn't and you'd like it to be expanded, but could it be covered more effectively by existing legislation?
No, is the answer. It couldn't be covered by existing legislation, because if it could, it would have been, and it hasn't. The number of women dead or left for dead by very serial stalkers and perpetrators is all the evidence that we need for that. But the reality of me focusing on this is that everything that is good that is in the domestic abuse bill has become because people like me and campaigners fought for it to be there in exactly the same way that I'm going to fight for this. It doesn't mean that I hate the rest of the legislation. I wrote some of it and I'm very, very, very proud of it, along with Laura, who she and I did exactly what I'm doing about this in order to change it so that we had the defences that mean that somebody can claim that somebody consented to their murder through a sex game. That's what I'm doing now. It's not a narrow focus. It's just campaigning for better things for women and children in our country.
Let me get some reaction from the other panellists. Willie, would you support the law being changed in this way in terms of stalkers being added to a register in Scotland?
Yes, and Jess is right. And Jess is right because it's not just about a database. This is an indication of the wider resource that's required in order to deal with what is a very significant problem. And we know through the lockdown and the pandemic that women have been at the forefront. They've borne the biggest burden through this pandemic. And if we're going to leave one legacy at the end of this, it needs to be greater support for women and a bigger voice for women. And that's why I'm in full admiration of the work that Jess is doing, because she's absolutely right. It is more than just about a database. It is about the resource that goes with it to try and help women on a daily basis, prevent them from being abused and stalked. So she's absolutely right about this.
Lucy, in your mind, what's the sort of broader political potency of this issue?
Oh, well, it's enormous, particularly in the wake of the Sarah Everard horrific murder in recent weeks. And I think a lot of questions have been asked among supporters of the amendment in the Lords, why the government appears to have backed away from supporting it after initially signalling that they were for it. Priti Patel sort of said that the issue of serial stalkers must be addressed. There were sources close to Robert Buckland, the Justice Secretary, quoted in the Sunday Times as being supportive. So there appears to be a sort of sense of bemusement among some MPs about why the government isn't wanting to sort of, pick up the baton and do more. If it doesn't want this amendment, bring forward its own proposals.
Laura, do you want to respond to that briefly before I go to George? Has there been a change? Has there been a sort of change of heart on this?
Well, I think the key point is that if you had MAPA Category 4, which was a domestic abuse clause, there would be almost no circumstances where somebody wouldn't meet the test for Category 4, but also be in 3 or 1. So you would have people who could be categorised under more than one category. And so the government doesn't want to kind of make it more complicated. And they're looking, for example, at a new data sharing system. I know that Jess will be familiar with this, MAP, which is a shorthand for a new sort of technology that will improve data sharing between the 3 categories and agencies. And also the new police bill that's working its way through Parliament brings in other sources to the data sharing process of MAPA. So it's not just police, prisons and probation services. It would also include things that people like GPs who are often directly involved with people, high risk offenders and those who surround them who could share information. So that's where the focus is at the moment.
I will come to you, George, but I think I could hear Jess trying to come in.
Yeah, the truth is unless we have a category where domestic abuse is on there, because currently Laura is absolutely right, they could have all gone on there, 0.8%. In the last data gathering, were on there. Everybody who's been murdered by a serial offender was not on there. So the reality is we need that category because I don't want it to be a question about whether they can or can't go on there. I want them on there.
Just to step back a little bit, George, with you, this is very comprehensive legislation. It's important legislation. Is it right to focus on what the bill is going to do, what it will do, and the issues it will address?
Well, look, yeah, there's a lot of good stuff in there, but, I'm with Jess on this. Anyone who's ever met a victim of domestic abuse is likely to hear the same story, which is that, then I found out he'd done that to his previous girlfriend and the girlfriend before that. And we see these patterns of abuse, patterns of stalking, patterns of violence, pattern of threat, which simply aren't being properly addressed at the moment. So this isn't a minor issue which can be shunted off into an annex or discussed at a later date. This is absolutely fundamental to preventing this horror from recurring and recurring and recurring for so many women.
We're going to leave it there. Jess Phillips, thank you very much for coming onto the programme to talk about it. It's Earth Day, you may not know, or you may know it is. It's also the climate summit that's been organised by Joe Biden in the United States. It's a 2-day global summit with world leaders, including Chinese Xi Jinping. And it's happening... in fact, there's the story. BBC News covering it. Climate change, Biden summit to push for immediate action. I think there are about 40 world leaders. They're meeting virtually, of course. And it's happened in the same week that Boris Johnson, the Prime Minister here, set out more ambitious targets to cut carbon emissions in the UK by 2035. So, George, you must be thrilled.
Well, yeah, at last. I mean, the US has been such a drag on climate talks for so long, particularly under Trump, but not just under Trump. I mean, I have to say that Obama, he just didn't press home his advantages during the first 2 years of his presidency and contributed really to a long record of failure. So it's really exciting to see this. How much Biden can get through the Senate is another matter altogether. It doesn't go far enough. It's not nearly enough to prevent more than 1.5 degrees of global heating, which governments are supposed to do under the Paris Agreement, but it's a lot better than there was before.
And here as well, would you agree in terms of changing the target, putting it into law to reduce emissions by 78% by 2035 compared to 1990 levels?
Well, it's great we've got the new target, but, what's really important is what's actually happening. And I'm afraid the record is pretty disastrous, scandalous, in fact. Here we have a government which makes these grand pronouncements on what we're going to do to prevent climate breakdown, and then it's still putting £27 billion into the roads programme, expanding airports, the total fiasco of its Green Homes grant, which collapsed and was then pulled. So,
but you say
where's the reality? Where's the ground testing?
Well, the reality, there are some stats, actually, that do point to some reality. The UK was the first member of the G20 to adopt a net zero target, and it has the most rapid historical reductions in emissions in the G20. That's the Committee for Climate Change. UK greenhouse gas emissions have fallen 40% since 1990. Looking at those figures, you'd say we were a world leader.
Yes, and we did do great work in decarbonising the power sector. What we've done is to move away from coal, move into
that's a success.
Renewables in the big. That's a success.
Right.
The real problems are the transport sector, where we haven't made any progress at all since 1990. The homes, where there's just been a total failure. To replace power sources, to properly insulate them and the rest of it, and agriculture and land use. And in those three areas, we're completely stuck. We just haven't made the progress we should have made, and that's because of policy failure on the part of government.
Laura?
Well, I just to pick up on that point, I think by setting a new target, the 78% decarbonisation by 2035, you can see the scale of the government's ambition. The net zero target is 2050, and they could have left that as something that they did the heavy lifting in on the last decade or so. In fact, you're seeing them front load that. And I don't think anyone would actually disagree with George that the big challenges are around heating houses, insulating houses, getting consumer habits to change around the way we consume meat and other things that he raised. But the government isn't giving up. Where there has been a sort of a blip, they're sort of renewing their ambition. And that, I think, is reflected in the most recent announcement. And in every message you see coming out of, whether it's DEFRA or the Department of Business and what they're doing. And there have been other actually really big achievements, things like the Blue Belt and what they're doing on marine life, something that doesn't get very much press, is really kind of extraordinary work on our oceans. Areas like that where we are offering real global leadership, I think just, deserve to be given more attention than they get.
Briefly, George, because I want to bring the others in to respond.
Yeah, so the sense is that the easy things have been done because, you can change your power sources without actually upsetting people. You still turn on the light and the light comes on. It doesn't make any difference. The really difficult thing is changing transport, is changing the way we live at home, is changing the food we eat. And to be honest, the government has shied away from that. And this is the nettle it's got to grasp.
All right. In terms, Willie, your manifesto has a green thread running through it, but you can't transition overnight. How do you bring Scottish people on board, particularly those who work in the oil and gas industries?
It needs to be a just transition. We need to make sure we don't repeat the mistakes of the 1980s, where we collapsed lots of industries and many people were left on the scrap heap. So we need to fully utilise the potential of the coast of Scotland in particular with our renewables, but yet we're still building the bulk of the platforms for those wind farms on the other side of the planet. That's not a good sign. We're also not really making progress on cutting back on flights. I cannot believe that we're still putting that third runway in at Heathrow. That seems wholly irresponsible. But the final thing is, we can create lots and lots of jobs by reforming our heating systems in our homes.
All right.
We want to put in 1 million air source heat pumps in people's homes. That will create lots of jobs and opportunities for people. So that's the way that you do it.
Right. So are you going to guarantee everyone working in the oil and gas sector will have a job in this greener future in Scotland?
That's our ambition. Our ambition is we've got £5,000 grants for
that's an ambition, not a guarantee. And over what time frame?
But we've put the policies in place to make sure we can reform the system, to make sure we can employ everybody, because we will need the skills and talents of everyone in this country if we're going to achieve it.
Right. I mean, George, do you accept some of the big polluters, as you see them, employ thousands of people?
Well, they do, but they will no longer be able to employ thousands of people if they're left with stranded assets, which we can't burn anymore because we'll cook the planet if we do that. And these big employers have to get ahead of the curve for the sake of their workers as well as for the sake of life on Earth.
Right, but
that means much faster decarbonisation, much faster retiring of their reserves of oil and gas.
Right, but what would you do? What would governments do in their position? They've got to look after the people and those communities, haven't they, that work in those industries. Are you saying they should abandon them?
Well, no. Look, abandoning them is saying, let's just carry on with business as usual. That is abandonment, because eventually business as usual is just going to go smack into the wall of international policy, which will simply prevent us from continuing to burn so much oil and gas. We've got to get ahead of that. We've got to say there's going to be a massive rollout of offshore wind, just as Willie says, and these places which are currently the hubs for oil and gas become the hubs for offshore wind, for high voltage DC connectors, connecting that wind to the grid, for all the exciting new technologies which can decarbonise our energy supply.
Laura?
I don't like the idea of sort of framing any particular business as a kind of an enemy. I mean, I think when you have the kind of hard to abate sectors, you need to work with them to get them on board as sort of partners on this. And actually, when you look at, for example, some of the stuff that Shell's doing with the kind of rollout of electric vehicle charging points on its forecourts, no, it's not perfect. And of course, there needs to be a fundamental change to its business model. But I think it's incumbent upon governments to work with them and to sort of to get them along as part of the effort to work with businesses, rather than to kind of treat them as pariah enterprises or pariah sectors that need to be closed down.
Lucy, what do you make of the government's and recent announcements?
Well, I think it is widely, welcomed. I can't see any sort of quarter of society that wouldn't welcome the more ambitious target. Of course, it's part of a wider foreign policy objective for Boris Johnson to make the COP26 summit in Glasgow this November a really big success, getting other nations on board. I do think it's really important to see what happens with China, because it's all very well for the UK to make a more ambitious target. Good news to see today to see President Biden also pledged to halve US emissions by 2030 from the 2005 levels. But I think there's a danger that if you don't get other major players on board, particularly China, which under some metrics is the biggest polluting country of all, then there's a risk of individual companies or indeed individuals in their homes looking at boilers, installations, thinking, well, there's no point us bothering if there's still, thousands of coal factories opening a year in China.
Right. And George, just finally, we haven't got long. How do you persuade companies and perhaps even individuals to change their behaviour? Taxes, closing them down?
Taxes, regulations, incentives for better stuff. But fundamentally, it's about leaving fossil fuels in the ground. And you just say to oil companies, sorry, you can't bring this stuff out anymore. We're just not going to be using it.
Thank you to all of you. Thanks to all my guests. That's all we have time for. I will be back on Monday at 12:15, but have a very good few days. Make sure you join me then. From all of us here, bye-bye.